Good morning, good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to the fourth session of this year's EduFin Summit, the financial education event organized by the BBVA Center for Financial Education and Capability. In this edition, a wide array of international experts will discuss the state of financial education after the COVID-19 outbreak, as well as the role of financial education in the recovery of our society and its transition towards a more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable one. And with no further delay, I will begin with our first keynote speaker, Gautam Bardwai, co-founder of Pinbox Solutions. Pinbox is a global pension tech and expert advisory firm committed to digital micro-pension inclusion for self-employed women and youth across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Over the last 2 decades, Gautam has worked closely with several governments, regulators, development institutions, and financial inclusion stakeholders on pension policy formulation and on the design of digital strategies for expanding pension coverage for informal workers. Mr. Bardwai will present his views on the topic of collaborative frameworks for financial services providers. Gautam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah De Presna. I'm very grateful for the invitation from BBVA and delighted to be here. Before I talk about some of the experiences that we've had in building using collaborative frameworks for expanding pension coverage, let me just take a step back and put this a little in context. What is happening is that pension and social protection benefits are typically available to salaried workers. This is true all over the world. And typically pensions are really part of an employment contract that I sign as a salaried worker with my employer, and I derive a pension when I stop working. Now, unfortunately, the informal sector workforce, or people who are not salaried, it forms the majority of the workforce between Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So typically this population could be anywhere between, say, 10% of the workforce, between 70% of the workforce to 90% of the workforce. And on average, about 80-85% of all workers in, say, Asia, Africa, and the LAC do not get a pension because they are not employed, or they're not salaried, shall I say. So as a result, what happens is for this population, if they don't accumulate enough savings during their years in the workforce voluntarily and on their own, they end up facing about 20, 30, or 35 years, depending on longevity. They end up facing multiple decades of poverty when they are too old to work, and that is the case. So I'm going to give examples of 2-3 countries that we are now working in. For instance, in India or in East Africa, in Rwanda and Kenya. But one of the things that I wanted to do was to give you one example of how collaborative frameworks were established and how collaboration was among various stakeholders. Was used as a way to not only improve education and knowledge, but also improve participation on a voluntary basis in long-term pension programs. The biggest problem, and I think if you think about financial inclusion, perhaps voluntary pensions is the most difficult end of financial inclusion. And it is also perhaps the most difficult part of behavioral finance. I mean, you're expecting somebody who's currently young, who doesn't understand the concept of pensions and doesn't necessarily have know retirement as a concept very well. The person probably has irregular, intermittent, modest incomes. You're expecting such people to save for themselves. And when you look at the reason that this becomes even more challenging is because this population is about 1.8 billion people across the developing world. And that's like gigantic. So the challenge really is, how do you then convince people? And it's not it's not a short-term product. It's not, you don't want a behavioral change which is short-term. You want a behavioral change which is sustained and which will carry forward a behavior over the next 20, 30, 40 years of the working life of young workers. And before I talk about, let's say, give you throw three things which we find are critical and which perhaps form the basis also of the way we think about financial inclusion and collaborative approaches. One is around simplicity. So what are the decisions that we want people to make? And typically what we've seen is the more complicated finance is, the more we need to invest time, effort, and resources in achieving optimum or appropriate levels of knowledge before people are able to step forward and buy financial services. So the simpler we make it, the easier it is to explain to people, and the better the chance that we have for achieving sustained impact at scale. Typically, the way we think about this is that if I'm trying to encourage, say, a gig worker or a farmer or a self-employed woman somewhere who's running a small shop in some village, before I start talking to them about, the complex part of the product, can we simplify this so that the questions that she has to ask really should be, should I save for retirement? How much should I save? And how often or how frequently can I afford to save? And if you can do this, I think the chances of achieving more meaningful knowledge when people come through the door becomes better. The second thing that we've seen in our experience in different countries is the who part, which is, who are we really targeting? And what we've seen is that people relating to a particular product or to particular financial solutions, people being able to relate to them and empathize with those products is extremely important. I need to believe this is a product for me. So if we were to, let's say, stand up in India or in Rwanda or in Kenya and say, listen, this is a pension scheme for informal workers, the chances are we won't get very much take up. Very few people will step forward and ask questions or want to know about it. And they would not be receptive, therefore, to even the knowledge that we are trying to deliver on this. So what we typically tend to do is think of people that we are targeting in a more segmented way. And one of the two things that we find which work very well, one is a gender-based segmentation. So women, for instance, or men. But more than that, we find occupational segmentation is a good way to think about trying to create homogeneous groups within the heterogeneous population that we see in the informal sector workforce. So then, instead of saying pensions for informal workers or self-employed people, it is we think that people become more receptive to education and knowledge if we say pensions for teachers, or social protection for farmers, or insurance for gig workers. And in the moment we say that, then the farmers or gig workers or whoever we are targeting actually then tend to step back and say, hey, this is something probably for me and I should pay attention, because this says it's a scheme for farmers, and therefore all the farmers will start paying more attention to that particular thing. And I'm just talking about the fact that it's important, and I think it also then tends to drive the way we think about education, what communication tools to use, what are the right products, how should we reach this population, etc. And the third is, which is on reaching, is the delivery part. How do we actually deliver the knowledge? Now, typically what we are seeing is across countries, and this is not a developing country problem. This is even in OECD countries. I'm sure the same problem exists in Germany or Madrid, is that agents and advisors don't have enough commercial incentives in small ticket pension and insurance products, and they just don't they tend to ignore the lower income market. They tend to find it commercially unviable. And since all finance firms tend to depend on advisors and agents and so on and so forth, the lower income population then becomes completely, they become delinked from the knowledge and information that they need at the front end, because nobody's willing to talk to them. In this, what we've done, for instance, in India, one of the things that we are doing is we're saying, okay, if agents don't work for lower income people and advisors are not interested, can we think of only digital solution? Now, the problem with digital solutions is then I have to convince 400 million people who are informal sector workers in India to convince them to download some new app and learn that app from scratch and so on and so forth, which is, I'll have to end up spending billions of dollars in many years to try and cultivate the digital change or the digital behavior, shall I say. So what we've done, let's say in India, is we've simply said, okay, can we replace our app with other third-party apps that people are very familiar with and are using every day in their everyday lives? So what we've done is we've pulled out our apps and replaced our app with WhatsApp. So what we've done is a deep integration with WhatsApp. So today, let's say people in India or Rwanda or in Indonesia or in Chile can actually start using WhatsApp in whatever language they want to be, they think it makes sense for them, to easily open a pension account. And instead of filling up a 7-page form, they just spend 5 minutes and actually set up a national ID linked pension account. So, and I feel that if this kind of thinking can be cultivated, the second challenge then becomes, how do you align incentives? How do you get different stakeholders with different goals? How can you align their incentives so that they are able to put the appropriate amount of effort involved in achieving appropriate outcomes? Now, the sense that we have is we are not only talking financial education, we are talking financial education to impact behavior, and not only impact behavior, but also achieve sustained behavior change. In that case, one of the things that, or one of the segments, let me give you an example, is, let's say, domestic health. Now, maids, cooks, drivers, nannies, security guards, this is a population which has reasonable incomes, or fairly regular incomes, but they're extremely expensive to reach because they're all tucked away and hidden in different homes across different countries. In an aggregate level, this is a population which is more than 100 million people. In India alone, there are 30 million people who work as domestic health. So we've been thinking, let's say, on how to use digital solutions and a collaborative framework for delivering a regulated pension, insurance, and savings solution to domestic health. So what we've done is we've created a digital platform called Gift a Pension, where, let's say, Diana, who has a cook and a nanny at home, she says, okay, I am happy to spend some time with my domestic health and talk to her about whether she's saving for old age. How should she think about this? What is her portfolio currently looking like? And our sense is a lot of us are anyway financial advisors for our domestic health. When my maid wants a loan, she comes to me. When my driver wants to build a house back home and he needs some loan or something, he comes to me. Or if our cooks' children fall ill, they typically go to my pediatrician, or my children's doctors. So typically we are the financial advisors in any case, or the banks or whatever. I mean, we are providing loans and other things. So what we said was, if we are doing all of that, could we as civil society or as change makers, as individuals, can we be given a digital solution by which we can open a pension account? And we did this, and this is now a solution that is active in both Kenya and India. So employers are one part of the stakeholder group. They step forward and they use digital mechanisms. So as an employer, I can use my WhatsApp to open a pension account in 5 minutes for my health. Not only that, I can actually start contributing $50 into a pension account to motivate her to start saving for retirement. The second is finance firms. They find this very attractive because they're saying, okay, then I don't have to go to 30 million people in India and individually collect $10, $20 from all of them. What I am doing is, by using digital and technology, I'm able to aggregate the entire demand. So I don't deal with 30 million people. I start dealing with wholesale assets or wholesale, aggregated premiums. So it becomes less expensive for finance firms to then reach out to this entire population. It becomes a non-linear model. And they're willing to then say, okay, I'm happy to support in the form of easier and simpler products. I'm happy to put money into promotions and building financial literacy tools that employers can digitally use for delivering to their domestic health. Regulators, for instance, in India, have stepped forward and said, fine, we will permit employers to co-contribute for their domestic health. So normally there are restrictions. I can't put money into Diana's insurance account or her pension account. But we've been able to get that kind of a relaxation from regulators saying, okay, third-party contributions to help pensions for lower-income people is permitted by employers. The fourth are policymakers. And in India, as well as in Rwanda, the government is actually stepping forward and saying, okay, if I'm giving tax breaks to rich people to motivate long-term savings behavior, can I give not tax incentives, but fiscal incentives by incurring similar expenditure for the poor to motivate long-term behavior? So governments in India and Rwanda have actually stepped forward and said, okay, every time this lady saves $50, I will put $25 into a pension account. So I think, it's sort of stepping into an employer's shoes Then you have large employers like, say, an IBM or a McKinsey can step forward and say, we have a large number of our employees who are higher income people. They all have domestic help. And as part of our CSR, we are willing to adopt this gift a pension model to encourage our own staff to then gift a pension to their domestic help. And then you have people like Facebook or WhatsApp who are saying, okay, we are happy to put some serious shoulder into digital media, into social media, into converting this idea into more of a movement to sort of, get more and more employers to step forward and actually, support this kind of an initiative. So I think our sense is, to just sort of summarize, our sense is that if we think about it, I think it's mainly around alignment of incentives and making sure that all stakeholders see a role for themselves. And the second is also, I think it is really using technology as glue to bring the stakeholders together on a collaborative platform or on a platform in which they are in a position to collaborate for meaningful, sustainable impact for a population which otherwise is going to face 30 years of old age poverty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gautam. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. It's very good to see how financial intermediaries can collaborate too. Thank you so much. To continue this session, I have the honor to introduce Diana Mejia. Diana Mejia is Senior Specialist for Public Policy and Competitiveness at CAF. Previously, she worked at the Bank of the Republic, which is the Central Bank of Colombia, where she held a number of positions, including Head of Economy and Financial Education and Head of Institutional Communications. She has provided advisory services to national governments in the design and implementation of nationwide financial inclusion and education strategies. And she holds a bachelor's and a master's degree in economics from the Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. She also holds a master in public administration from the John Fitzgerald Kennedy School of Government in Harvard University. Diana is as well a very active member of the advisory board of the Center for Financial Education and Capability, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank her for her tireless involvement and continued support. Ms. Mejia will participate in Spanish and will present the interesting topic of the coordination between public and private sectors in financial inclusion and financial education. Diana, tienes la palabra.
Muchas gracias, Lidia.
Thank you very much, Lydia. And I'd like to thank the BBVA for its kind invitation to be able to take part in this important event. There's, quite a while that I have been supporting BBVA as an advisor from the Center for Financial Capabilities, but also in these very important events in order to deepen on the analysis in the challenges of financial education around the world. So today I'm going to be very short, and we would like to focus on the fundamental challenges that do include the leading strategies of financial inclusion. Those scenarios of coordination between the different stakeholders in the public and private industry in order to promote financial inclusion. And I would like to begin by giving you a little bit of a context and precisely in order to generate different mechanisms of the different stages in the design and the implementation of the national strategies and as well as the public policies of financial inclusion. It is essential to maintain these governance schemes, not only designing active governance mechanisms, but maintain them through the passing of time. And it is precisely because what we've seen from the studies that we have had, we realize, we had an OCDE announcement, the challenges of the financial inclusion strategies. And we realized that the active participation of all relevant stakeholders can contribute in the successful implementation of the national strategies. Before we talk about this coordination between public and private sector, I would like to refer to the importance of the schemes, the governance schemes, like the design of the schemes, and how this is a key for the implementation of strategies. And we have realized that there is a relevance to identify a national coordinator or a technical secretary that has a nature that allows you to roll out the implementation of these strategies and protect them from political swings. This is something that we have commonly seen in the countries in Latin America mainly, and on the other hand, identifying mandates for the different institutions or involved entities in the different areas of the strategies. These could be implicit mandate. Yep, we see in Latin America these are implicit and fully identified based on existing mandates, ranging from financial stability and consumer protection. And also we've seen that there is also explicit mandates through decrees, laws, and public policies that have been formulated to such end. Such mandates, they facilitate the design and the implementation of the national strategies to be more sustainable and guarantee the responsibility and visibility to the general public, as well as the general recognition of all the government and the public institutions being involved. And it also allows us to facilitate the participation among different institutions. The effective leadership and these legal mandates can also increase the capacity that the national strategies have in order to overcome these changes in the high-level personnel. For instance, when we are talking about changes in the ministries, changes in government, changes within the institutions or public institutions. And as to the participation in the national committees, we also think that this facilitates the creation of such interaction between the different public and private institutions. And here it would be important to add all public institutions and private institutions that may be relevant. Now, if we go in a deep dive analysis of the contribution of the private sector, we strongly believe that it is extremely important to note that the national strategies must have a leadership by the public authorities. It is also very important to note that the private sector needs to be involved, not only in the implementation of the programs, as oftentimes it happens in the countries of the region, but also to participate somehow in the governance of the national strategies, inclusion strategies, and financial inclusion. And here it is important to see that oftentimes people believe that the participation in the private sector may lead to some conflicts of interest, and that's why it is important to establish safeguards and can minimize the onset of these conflicts of interest through the use of code of conducts and guidelines that many countries are implementing. And there are many guidelines internationally in this regard. What we've seen is that this can also be achieved with an effective financial consumer protection framework. If the participation in the private sector can be embedded or be coordinated with general financial consumer protection schemes, this is going to be much more effective. And we've also realized that the private sector precisely can also add several benefits to actively participate in these governance schemes, the national strategies, inclusion and financial health, through different financial resources, the experience, and we've also seen that the private sector is well positioned. Those are in direct contact with the financial users, and this allows them to leverage on issues related to adequate moments for teaching. And when users are taking the important financial decisions depending on their life cycle, and it also allows them to combine financial health with the inclusion efforts. And precisely, the study I mentioned, the OECD and the CAF study, based on several surveys that we carried out to the different people involved in the national inclusion strategies in Latin America, we realized that the institutions involved in the implementation of the strategies report as, quite a substantial involvement of the private sector in the initiatives. These relationships haven't been formalized through the different governance structures of the national strategies. And they are in a space called programmatic efforts. The financial institutions and the private industry entities participate supporting some of the programs, but they are not involved in most cases in an effective fashion in these governance schemes, which means that in reality, the private sector is useful supporting programs, but also it is not involved in these coordination schemes. What we have seen, however, is that the involvement of the private sector in the national inclusion strategies is key for the effectiveness of those. And that's why we believe that in defining the governance structures of the national strategies, the roles and responsibilities shall be very clear and defined. The roles of the public sector, which is the most relevant authority to lead these national strategies. But it is also important to have the participation of the private sector. And defining the roles and responsibilities, we managed to avoid these conflicts of interest I mentioned before. And taking into consideration the following: the prohibition of financial health as a commercial activity by the commercial institution can end up being too commercial. And on the flip side, we've realized that these organizations, the private organizations, are more willing to tackle these clients that are more easily accessible, are more profitable. But on the flip side, these are issues that can be avoided with these codes of conduct that I've mentioned before. However, I would like to finish by giving you some examples. We have seen that there are already cases in Latin America that are worth mentioning, with an important participation orchestrated from the governance structure of financial inclusion in Latin America, like Brazil and Peru. And these countries have found the way to include these institutions in the governance of their national strategies of financial health, specifically financial health. And in the case of Brazil, talking about the strategy of financial education that exists since 2010, the private sector has reached a key factor in the governance, especially in the work groups for the implementation of materials, educational materials, for production and implementation of these materials for the schools in the country. And with the challenge of facilitating this implementation, they created the Association of Financial Inclusion in Brazil, which is a non-for-profit organization whose team and structure are financed by the private sector in the country, the stock exchange, among others. And they have a cooperation agreement with the National Committee for Strategy or Financial Health, in order to coordinate the implementation and the fundraising for the entire project portfolio in the country. So we believe this is a good example and an interesting case as to the coordination between sectors, public and private sector, really leads to more effective implementation. By way of conclusion, the involvement of the private sector precisely in the governance of the strategies, national strategies, contains positive elements like, for instance, the contribution of financial resources, But not only that, their expertise, the knowledge on things, financial topics, and most importantly, things related to the different channels. So we realize in Gotham's presentation that these channels and the possibility to properly understand clients, to segment types of clients, is really a very important perspective that the financial institutions have that can be taken into consideration in these schemes. Moreover, the financial institutions are well positioned to reach to a broader audience, leveraging on these moments linked with the key financial decisions, the life cycle moments, and also the possibility to combine financial education with the different financial inclusion efforts, as well as other efforts, as we call the learning by doing, as we call it in our community. So the conclusion is as follows. It is important, and the financial industry is a very relevant stakeholder. You need to shed some light on this active involvement in the different coordination schemes to organize the different financial inclusion strategies, trying to avoid conflicts of interest by creating codes of conduct. I'll leave it to it, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, Diana. Such an interesting reflection, all that the private sector can contribute. That goes beyond the mere funds raising or contribution, where traditionally we see the private sector in having a positive impact in society. I'm going to switch to English once again in order to introduce you to Carmen Perez.
Carmen Perez, she's Managing Director of NantiClam. NantiClam is a non-profit organization specialized in microfinance, inclusive entrepreneurship, and financial health, and has more than 18 years' experience in Spain and Latin America. Carmen, prior to managing NantiClam, led the social economy and microcredit unit in the foundation of the Andalucía Savings Bank, where she launched 2 microfinance programs and a project of financial education linked to corporate volunteering. She teaches microfinance at Comillas University, at the Universidad Autónoma of Madrid, and at the Alcalá de Henares University, also in Madrid. And Carmen holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy and education, a master in management of non-profit organizations, and she also has a specialized course in microfinance and social development. Carmen will also present in Spanish, and she will talk about the topic of collaborative frameworks, in this case with social entities. Carmen, tienes la palabra.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Lydia. I'd like to thank BBVA for this kind invitation to allow me to participate in this event. I'm going to try and show you the point of view of NGOs in this very fascinating topic, financial health. And to begin with, I would like to tell you how we began our work in the field of financial health, because we are a specialized entity in microfinance. That's all we do: microfinance, inclusive entrepreneurship, and financial health. All the entrepreneurial programs include financial health training, which is fundamental to us for entrepreneurs. But it is since 2017, in the annual conference of the Annual Network of Microfinance, the motto was financial health and the vulnerable population. All the micro entities microfinance entities, signed a manifesto to become legitimate, to play a role in society for financial health, especially for the less off. A, because we are in contact with these vulnerable groups, and B, because we had the knowledge and the know-how in the field of financial health. And this is also a very important aspect to be noted, because it is the importance of the collaborative networks in order to boost initiatives like this one. And it is from that moment onwards that we kicked off and we began working with financial health, not linked to entrepreneurship. And we began with a program, migrant entrepreneurial women in vulnerable situations. We created some working groups that wanted to, improve their financial capabilities. The idea was to empower them from a financial point of view. This program was very interesting to us because it moved us, away from the entrepreneurial aspect to it. And the biggest boost was a project in 2018, supported by the JP Morgan Foundation, in which we suggested, let's work on financial health with the vulnerable population in general. For this pilot project, we began doing the following: an in-depth study of financial health on vulnerable, population in Madrid. Take a look at it on the website, where we organized different research activities in the field of financial health, but in a survey to private institutions or the NGOs or non-for-profit organizations. We asked them, those involved in the day-to-day of these vulnerable people, and on the flip side, others related to the governance or the directives of these units. And in this in-depth study, we realized about the importance played on financial health, but there was lack of awareness by social workers about the importance of these topics related to financial health, let alone the intervention with these families or the social diagnosis when somebody would approach their organization. And that was the very beginning of the conclusion or the need that on top of addressing these type of individuals with whom we are directly involved, whose impact in the number of people was going to be very limited, we decided to broaden the project and to approach all those social workers from the private institutions that would become our allies in the project in order to bring it to the next page. This is what we could reach individually. And I would mention this later on. This had a knock-on effect, which was, again, the impact of this intervention with a great positive impact in the external assessment, because we reach further individuals. The program revolved around the 4 components of financial health and other indicators that measure it. We've taken those from the Financial Health Network, and we adapted those to Spanish standards because some of them were very Anglo-centric. They didn't match our environment. So spending, saving, planning, and each of those has 2 indicators that we measure for the families and households in these vulnerable situations, just to know how good is their financial health. So spending, if they spend less than what they earn, or can they pay the basic utility supplies in time and in full. Regarding savings, are they used to save money, or do they have enough savings to at least cover 1 month of regular expenses? And then regarding debt, are they aware of what's their amount of debt, and is their debt smaller than 10% of the total income they have? And then regarding the planning, do they have any family budget, and are they proactive in their financials? So when we started with this project, there were several obstacles. First, the lack of training of these professionals, which we've mentioned already, and we're talking about the social workers here. Also knowing how important financial health is in the life of a person, and also the rejection finance generates, at least in Spain. It's not a nice subject to approach.
We've also seen a huge digital gap between vulnerable populations and not vulnerable, and financial health is the same. Let me just give you one example. Recently, during the pandemic, the government has started offering the minimum income. It can only be done online, and many vulnerable families don't even have a computer. So that has been discussed in depth. So the program started, we offered 25 hours training to social workers from other NGOs, and we worked closely with these professionals, adapting ourselves to the itinerary they had or that NGO had, so that they could approach financial health, creating joint training programs between us and the social workers, and that's how we raised awareness, not just among social workers, but awareness among the vulnerable people as well. We've created many tools, made them available for social workers. We have a best practice manual, several in-depth manuals about savings, debt, banking services, and so on. Through the pandemic, we've had several webinars sharing all the news in the field. They are updated on our website and they can be watched later. We've opened a consultation channel online to answer to queries of social workers in their day-to-day, and also we've created an advisory board, experts in financial health. It's a collaboration between this civil society and a private organization. These volunteers are knowledgeable in finance and law, and they study and solve more complex cases, and then that's how they create knowledge among members of the team, spread knowledge among members of the team. How are we measuring the impact on the families? Well, there are small changes to the indicators that we measured initially. For example, had the family of the person managed to save a small amount per month or not? Were they aware of their debt, or had they reduced their debt at some point? Had they taken into account having some using some budget planning tool for their family spending? Most importantly, now they were aware of how important financial health was within their lives. We believe that's really relevant, and we need to really make the point of that. And then regarding the evaluation, because I see I have very little time left, the multiplying effect of the program, I believe, is the most relevant part. And we've been congratulated in different environments, and that's why we continue to train social workers, and we stay in the backstage just to solve the more complex questions they come to us with. But it's good for them to have all the basic tools. The greatest achievement of this collaboration, I believe, is the collaboration among these social institutions. We've been able to sit together and work to help the financial health of these vulnerable population. And I would also highlight collaboration between civil society, NGOs, and private companies. ING and JP Morgan are financing our programs at present, and I would like to thank them from here, by the way. And the collaboration of social institutions, we have a network of more than 70, and the importance of networks as could be, well, different platforms or the network to fight poverty and social exclusion, because they've made this problem visible. This problem until very recently was completely invisible and opaque. And I would also like to highlight how alliances and the importance this might be for public administrations is key. We need to continue driving this forward. This national plan for financial education, the representatives have been discussing this in depth, but I think that this needs to be made more visible with vulnerable population and with different public administration's financing projects. We've pioneered in this field, and we've taken this to different levels of the public administration. And something else that was made apparent when we closed the pilot with social workers is, why didn't we learn this at college? There is so much work to do. We need to introduce this curriculum on financial education in colleges for everyone. So I believe that, well, there's a silver lining going forward. There's a lot of work to do, and all of us need to continue working on it. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to hear you talk, and we know that the NGOs are key to learn the impact these financial education programs have in the vulnerable population. So thank you very much for participating.
For your participation and your very insightful words. I will now change to Spanish to present the workshop, so I invite the speakers, the keynote speakers, also to join us in this workshop. And de nuevo, gracias, Diana.
And once again, thank you, Diana, Carmen. And now I will give the floor. I will introduce the workshop. And in this workshop, we're going to talk about the main challenges of collaborating in financial education. As mentioned earlier, this workshop is going to take place in Spanish, and we encourage attendants to actively share their collaborative experiences and their opinions about the strengths and weaknesses of collaborating, the challenges and the and the forecasts. So if you want to participate in Spanish, just raise your hand. Somebody will give you the floor. If you want to participate in English, as I mentioned earlier, you can write your comments, questions in the chat box that you will see on the bottom corner of your WebEx. Please bear in mind, we cannot always follow a strict order of participation. We have Noelia Camera. She is an economist in regulation and digital trends within the BBVA research. She's going to be our facilitator, and she's worked in financial inclusion as well. Before joining BBVA research, she worked as a joint professor at the economy department of the University Carlos III in Madrid. She holds a PhD in economics from the University of Zaragoza, and she's been a visiting PhD in the University of Nottingham, and she did her postdoc research fellowship at the University of Vienna. Thank you very much, Noelia. You have the floor, and we can get the workshop started. Seems we have some slight technical issues in the workshop room. Let's give it a couple of minutes. Please stay in the conference. We have an audio issue we're solving now.
Perdonad, no sé si me oís, pero la sala está silenciada, la sala de prensa.
Noelia, te estamos oyendo perfectamente. ¿Tú me oyes a mí ahora?
Noelia, can you hear us? Yes? Okay, great. There must have been an issue with the connection. I've introduced you already, so please go ahead. Well, thank you very much, Lydia. Good morning, good afternoon to all the speakers and attendants to this workshop on collaboration frameworks to strengthen financial inclusion. We've had three magnificent, inspirational talks sharing different success cases to collaborate and, as they said, bring forward financial education, reach as many people as possible, following quality standards that enable users to use the right financial products and increase their well-being. Gotham talked about how a problem was identified, which is the difficulty individuals have to face difficulties in the future and starting to work on it immediately. I'm talking about retirement saving. As Gotham mentioned, it's important to align objectives, knowing what's the role of everybody involved, and technology has, this really important umbrella that enables us to reach more people and manage resources efficiently. Then Diana talked about how important it is to include all stakeholders at the same level. If there are only a few stakeholders designing the policies and the others just need to come on board later on, that doesn't seem to work. It's essential to introduce disciplinary mechanisms such as codes of conduct to make sure all the incentives are duly aligned. And as Diana said, it's really important to have all stakeholders at the same level. Carmen then shared another success case, another collaboration between social workers in the financial industry, and she identified a problem within the population, which is the lack or shortage of financial health among the more vulnerable groups. And then looking at all these success cases and collaborations, well, through this workshop, we would like to invite the attendees to share with us other frameworks of collaboration that they've seen succeed across different countries and for different communities. And we have 15 minutes for this. As Lydia explained, please keep your comments to 3 minutes, more or less. We'll try to go on a first come, first served basis, but that's not always possible. The technology doesn't enable that. And without further ado, let's see if somebody has raised their hand. I do encourage you to please use that feature of the WebEx, where you can raise your hand to share your experience, just like Gotham and the other two speakers did. Diana, did anybody raise their hand? If you're not going to take the floor, we would ask you to please mute your connection. Let's wait a couple of minutes. I'm sure all of you have really interesting comments to share in financial education. And I am sure that you've been part or you've led collaboration efforts that will have been successful. You can also share other projects that will, due to this, whatever circumstances, have not been successful, and we can analyze the analyze it to improve in the future. Noelia, let me be the icebreaker. I think it's interesting to talk about the collaboration framework that started in Spain a few years back through the financial education plan promoted by the Bank of Spain, the regulator, and the CNMV. Through that collaboration framework, there's a collaboration plan created, and there are many institutions, corporations, and foundations that have joined. I think it's really interesting to see how, even though financial institutions are not part of that plan directly, although often we collaborate through our foundations, we are constantly in touch with regulators in this field about this. Now, the Bank of Spain and the CNMV have been widely open to get the input from the financial industry and others, the social industry, for example, to launch updates on these financial education plans. And we've seen, well, the training at school. We've seen how digitalization has been added to the National Financial Education Framework. And in the first day of the summit, the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Spain mentioned how within financial education, we're going to start covering sustainability. That's really a success story, I believe, in Spain. And it has allowed us to spread knowledge around financials in this country. Now, there is another area of collaboration that I'm familiar with, which is within the banking industry through the Spanish Banking Association. Several banks, 21 in fact, are working on a program with junior achievement to provide financial education for the youth at school, in secondary level. So I believe that's another very interesting project. Okay, Carmen Perez, I see her hand raised. She's ready to engage.
Solamente las personas
Once again, please mute your connections if you're not participating.
con su mano levantada. Vemos que Carmen Pérez Sánchez quiere intervenir.
Sí, tengo la palabra.
Carmen, yes, you have the floor. Let me very briefly share the experience that we've had at the university. A group of students have volunteered to work. We're talking about students in second, third, and fourth year of business, the business major at Comillas, led by a consultant and other professionals, and they shared training journey to students who were the same age as our college students, but it was students that the so-called ninis in Spain. They don't study, they don't work, they're in very complicated situations. They were doing their first training in the hospitality industry. They were going to start with their internship at 400 euros per month, and they were just going to be given some basic financial education to know what to do, how to plan to spend those 400 euros internship grant. And like I said, there were some professionals and also the education and the tech staff of the foundation and the volunteers of the foundation.
Muchas gracias, Carmen. Tenemos por aquí.
Thank you very much, Carmen. We also see some raised hands from Fanny Blanco.
No sé si todo el mundo conoce la manera de levantar la mano.
Do you know the raise your hand functionality? At the bottom of your screen, you will see a thumbs up. Please click on the bottom and raise your hand. expressing your willingness to take part in this workshop.
Noelia, tenemos también una persona que se llama Eumir, con interés en participar.
Eumir is willing to take part. Can we give him the floor?
Hola, 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 ¿qué tal?
Te
Buenos
escuchamos.
días. Buenos días desde México.
Good morning from Mexico. Yes, I would like to share my view, my perspective. Beyond that framework, I'm not an authority, an expert in financial health, although I would like to add something to this workshop, this experience I've had. And here in Mexico, I had to live the following situation. At the very beginning when I joined, that was the implementation or rollout of financial health, of digital products that we were offering. However, from that moment onwards, we realized that beyond financial health as different modules that are connected to a software, to a product, financial health shall be embedded on the design and how this is going to arrive at clients. To the degree that we have even implemented some practices thinking about this parameter, how we shall take care of our revenues and our money, but also engaged in some practices being very transparent, very clear and concise in the way we are organized, in the way we express our views, our ideas, text, wording, things related to these products, but also adding other aspects. For instance, advancing, anticipating the client's financial health and behavior. And it seems that somehow one of the future steps going forward, is clients are going to have a certain degree of financial health, financial knowledge. However, if we, from the core, manage to anticipate ourselves from the study of their behavior, how they spend, how they save money, we can put forward certain actions or to give them some recommendations that, based on data plus the client's criteria, they can decide to take a decision or a more informed decision for the improvement or the application of this knowledge in the field of financial health. That's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much indeed. We also have another raised hand from Adriana Teodora. You have the floor. Hello, Adriana. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. And thank you very much for giving me the floor. Thank you very much for organizing these events. My name is Adriana from Brussels. I am a civil servant at the European Commission, and I am also doing my PhD at the Economic University of Bucharest. My thesis focuses on financial health. And from the university years until now, what I can give and share with you as example, the way I think it's the best example in the 27 EU member states. The best example is in the Netherlands. What Wim said yesterday. In this country, financial health is learned from the very basic levels, from primary, and it then continues until secondary, university, and it is implementing a digital platform, as we mentioned yesterday. This is chaired by Maxima of Ireland. Moneywise, this is one example, or the best example, of good practices in the European Union. That's all I wanted to mention. Thank you very much indeed. Oh, thank you. Any other examples, good practices that you want to share with us? Good practices that can keep on enriching this part? That's it on my side. If we still have some raised hands, we will continue, but I would like in the meantime to share another example, the cooperation of regulators in the United Kingdom with a fintech company. The regulators issued some recommendations for the financial institutions, where it said that the terms and conditions of financial products should be drafted in the way as follows: that a 10-year-old kid should be able to understand it, everything that was being explained in such financial product or such contract among both parties. And there was a public consultation for this proposal, for this good practice recommendation. And there is a fintech in cooperation with a group of pedagogues. They helped in the setup of certain drafts that then the financial industry adapted to its needs in order to, bring about these recommendations given by regulators or financial supervisors in the United Kingdom. Once again, it identified the need to simplify, as Gotham said, the understanding of financial products. Every single stakeholder works on those things that they deem they can do better, where they can contribute value. Fintech and pedagogues realized that they were the most adequate ones, or some of the most adequate ones, trying to make this effort of simplification. And regulators were the most adequate ones, or the entity in charge of conveying this to the financial system. Just to share that with you. Any raised hands? We're gonna shift gears now. We'll kindly request participants to raise your hands if you want to take part of the second block. Deepening on the leading obstacles facing this cooperation between stakeholders in order to boost financial health. In the meetings we held, there's been some examples. Diana was anticipating the conflicts of interest from the different parties and how there are mechanisms that may help mitigate from this conflict. And also we would like to know which other obstacles exist in this collaboration, with the aim of, thinking about the best solutions in order to solve it. Every participant willing to share may raise their hands. As we said before, at the bottom of the screen you have the participation button. Raise your hands and we will give you the floor, trying to respect the order. Okay? Noelia. Some of the obstacles we encounter in the private world, financial the financial health. Corporate social responsibility, the social programs, and I'm going to talk about the collaboration framework, public-private framework with social organizations. I think one of the leading obstacles we've encountered trying to collaborate with a social entity, and namely vulnerable groups, is the difficulty for measurement. How from private institutions, oftentimes we request some measurement models in order to see if the mechanisms of intervention to reach the entire population, sometimes it is very difficult to measure the impact. We had Carmen, they worked with JP Morgan, but I believe this is one of the issues they encounter, because in the private world, in the corporate world, measurement plays an awful lot of importance, understanding the impact of our programs with social organizations, and social organizations want to focus so much on beneficiaries, on vulnerable populations, and it is therefore more complicated to measure. So Carmen probably has a comment about this, but I do believe this is sometimes, lost in translation, how we all think differently. This is an example of measurement, but I'm sure there's many others to it. Thank you. Adina, do you want to take part on the second block, or your hand is still raised because you forgot to just block it? Adina, is there anything you want to comment? Any hindrance you've encountered in this collaboration in encouraging financial health? In my view, it is extremely important. What I just mentioned before, what the previous speakers mentioned, they talked about codes of conduct, because the conflict of interest and the stakeholders among the public and private stakeholders, this is very important, and I think this is the leading starting point, in my opinion. That was pretty much it. Thank you. Thank you, Adina. We also receive a remark stressing out the importance of, giving voice to the equality stakeholders. In order to make sure there isn't a single agent or entity leading the different policies. So, in principle, by definition, their voices should be raised in order to identify, in as much as possible, each one from their own potential strength, what are the leading needs, and in which way they can contribute to improve financial health at different levels, in different moments of the life cycle. Anyone else willing to participate? This is a comment submitted by Jessica Massey in order to make the adequate quote. Diana Mejia. Nice to talk to you, Noelia. Bear in mind the comments you've mentioned, and Lydia's remark, and all those things related to the public and private participation. Apart from what you've mentioned, it is very important to clearly set up the rules of the game. The participation of the private sector is very important, and the private sector needs to participate from the very beginning, to be within the governance schemes. With these clear or clearly defined rules and very well defined responsibilities. And aligning this with Lydia's message, these roles and responsibilities may well define you, because the goals of the strategies are to be well defined, as well as the indicators and sales. That I think it is very important to make sure that the national strategies and the programs should have clearly defined these goals and the results to be reached through the definition of these very good and interesting indicators, knowing who are those entities that are going to be responsible for this in order to achieve those goals. And that's where I think the role of the private sector is well defined. There are some macro levels that are the responsibility of the public sector, the public policy, but there's also other results at the program level, micro, that are also a responsibility of the private sector. And in these schemes, precisely these cooperation schemes and these national strategies, such clear definition of goals and indicators also facilitates coordination among the different stakeholders. So, defining the governance schemes, we also have the definition of some follow-up systems that allow you to ensure the compliance of these goals, the measurement, and the clear definition of indicators and responsible people in all the aspects of the national strategy. And this is, well, basically all I wanted to mention. Thank you very much, Noelia. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Diana. Well, I couldn't agree more. In fact, on the next part of this workshop, we will deepen on this perspective, because I do believe that one of the main disruptions to come from or to improve financial health can come from the measurement part. The capacity currently financial institutions have, at the end of the day, financial suppliers are going to collect data that can help you redefine policies. But let's leave it aside for now, and we will come back to it on the third block. Carmen Sanchez. Carmen Perez, sorry. Yeah, I'm not used to these live sessions. We're trying to fine-tune indicators because we believe measuring the impact of our programs is essential. But I think it is extremely important. But in order to get to those indicators, we need to work with people. First of all, we've realized that the financial health is completely alien to a lot of people. Social workers, working with them, helping them in household and so on. When that person becomes open and tells, I've got some debt, and it's only when this happens, when the mechanism happens, education and financial health in this population, and it is complicated because of that. We were super jealous.
Fuimos a visitar.
We went to visit a social institution working in the suburbs in London. Their first interview with vulnerable people was over the phone. They would ask them about their level of income and a lot of information that they would easily share. However, well, here it's much harder to get that information. And then finally, regarding conflict of interest, we have a lot of corporate volunteers in banking that support us in our programs and training to the vulnerable population. And we need to train them to, well, get them a bit of context and know what type of people they're going to be working with, because they haven't been in touch with vulnerable people. And their examples are normally, so if you're making $2,000 euros a month, and that's, you know, impossible for a person in this group. Thank you. Well, thank you, Carmen. Cultural issues must be taken into account, and that's why when we talk about the need of having surveys that compare across countries data from surveys to measure financial capabilities that are standard and follow the same guidelines, those are really good to set some common ground. But then the truth is that the reality of any group, region, country is going to help us approach each of the persons and their needs. So these surveys are great. They're very much needed, and they are a big help to learn and understand and create this type of knowledge, which is so necessary. Now, at the same time, it's really important to take into account that cultural aspects are really different. And what has worked in one country, in one group, may not work for another country or group. And so that level of prospect at macro level can create a lot of added value. I think I see some comments. Yes. So a comment has been made, and I wanted to add something else. Jose Ortega is asking us on the English chat box. He's asking about the role of education. Like the role of educational institutions, ministries, and authorities, both national and regional in Spain. And I love that question because financial institutions have often found a hurdle there because it connects with conflict of interest. Some cases, parents were worried, teachers were worried to have bankers teaching financial education at schools. And I think this approach is really very interesting. The hurdle that we see when they want to collaborate with schools or public institutions, it's hard to get their trust. And how is financial education offered in schools? We also see lots of recommendations from the OCDE mentioning how important financial education needs to start from a very early age so that young people can start their professional lives with some financial education. Oftentimes we find that teachers are the only ones sharing content that might be useful for them to educate children at school. That's a very interesting piece of information because I understand there might be lots of hurdles. I don't know if there is anybody representing educational institutions or authorities that can share their experience here in Spain and in other countries about how to embed financial education at schools. Should it be through a subject matter, cross-sectionally, together with private institutions? Does it need to be imposed by educational authorities? Okay, maybe some representative from this group wants to participate. In the meantime, we're going to give the floor to Gerardo. Good morning. Thank you very much for organizing this. I'm connected from Peru, and I would like to congratulate you for this fantastic workshop. I'm a college professor here in Peru. I do research, and I'm participating in this summit precisely because one of the things we want to research in Peru has to do with financial education. So I'm paying attention to all of your comments, and reality of other countries, well, I mean, between Spain and Latin America, we're a world apart in this regard. In Latin America, there are, well, some events taking place. First, informality. In Peru and Latin America, the job market is very informal. And also the fact that there is really no financial education from an early age. Definitely not at schools. So that's a key factor. I'm talking about this reality in Peru, basically. There's a lot of resistance. Lydia duly mentioned measuring impact. Well, I met with civil servants from the ECBS, the regulators of the financial banking industry in Peru, because we had a plan to measure impact, to say, well, this is the level of financial education in Piura. I'm a city north of Peru. And basically, they said, well, measuring impact, that's not what we do. What we do is, well, training, to particularly older people. Now, what's the problem? Regulators and many regional savings banks, and those are targeting micro entrepreneurs and vulnerable people. Well, they do the training to their clients, and that's how far it goes. And the problem is when you look at another organization, Minder Coffee, who looks at complaints by consumers, well, when you look at their reports, the institution that gets the most complaints are banks. So if I'm training, if I'm offering this training for free, how come the institutions are getting all these complaints about banks? I think that's an imbalance. And it comes from that situation that impact really is not measured. The regulators believe that just by offering that training, the problem is solved. But the truth is that they're not doing that. One of the shortages is that we are not educating citizens in some basic financial knowledge, because those citizens are potential consumers, potential entrepreneurs. And we don't see any progress. So there might be, I don't know, we could create an observatory, a public or private institution to measure this. Because if we do not measure, we really don't know if that training offered is successful or not. About the informality, the gender issue with women in the pandemic, during the pandemic, these bonds that the government was offering through the pandemic. There were lots of contagions because people were queuing in the banks branches to get that money from the government because they didn't have bank accounts. So that's being corrected. In Peru, it might not work as well as in other more developed countries such as Europe, the UK, or the US, where there are vulnerabilities, but there is a lot less impact than in Latin America. Well, thank you very much, Gerardo. You've made some very interesting points, and you've touched upon one of the key hurdles, which is measuring impact. Measuring impact is really complex. Nevertheless, it's something that we need to do. And the tools that we have available to measure correctly are becoming increasingly sophisticated, and therefore we need to continue working along these lines. I believe Lydia has a comment. Yes. Well, listening to Gerardo, I see that there are cultural issues. Often we believe that any social program intervention will just be outright successful in any country, but you need to take into account always the cultural connotations and circumstances. Within our center, and I've mentioned it often, we have an advisory body made up of different members. Probably, Gerardo, you're familiar with Rolando Arellano, a member of our advisory board. He's the founder of Arellano Consulting to Grow. They came up with a very interesting report a few years ago regarding the financial inclusion issues in Peru and how Peruvians interact with their banks. And the problem that he put on the table was lack of trust in financial institutions. I don't know if you're familiar with this research, with this report. I would like to know, in any case, what's your opinion about this lack of trust? Does it play a role in leading, the population to complain more about banks or not to trust banks? And maybe that's why they don't realize that beyond getting a loan, they can also be an ally when getting financial education. Yes, I'm familiar with Rolando Arellano. He's a very prestigious researcher here in Peru. His latest research is on happiness. Now, what you say is true, Lydia. Now, lack of trust is the main factor. When I did my research, financing SMEs, about financing SMEs, I found there was a lot of resistance from citizens and people to use financial services precisely because they did not trust these services, because the language used by financial entities doesn't adapt to the cultural level of citizens. There might, we're talking about professionals, electricians or masons. They have very little in terms of formal schooling, and when they face somebody speaking this very technical lingo and wearing a tie, they don't trust them. So cultural issues definitely have impact. And that's why, because out of lack of trust, people will put their money under their beds. They won't open an account because they believe they're going to be charged fees and commissions, and that stems directly out of the lack of knowledge, lack of financial education, which drives this exclusion, particularly in Latin America. Because I see the same reality in other countries. In Mexico, for example, there's a lot of resistance because of the cultural factors and that extremely technical language that bankers tend to use. And that's why there is a disconnect between them and the clients, and financial exclusion prevails precisely because of that. So lack of trust, I believe, is at the origin of financial inclusion. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gerardo. That is definitely something to consider from different angles. Now, from an industry perspective, the private industry and private consumers. Now, I would like to link your comment to Gotham's presentation, where he mentioned how important it is to know the client, how important it is to segment more, because that's going to help us to approach them better and expand the variety of financial products that we make available to consumers. Now, if we are approaching a client with something that outright is not going to match their needs, we're going to generate this lack of trust, and they're not going to buy the product unless they don't have another choice, right? But in any case, they will never be completely happy with it. This happens with financial products, and this happens as well with the rest of products that we use. And there's a whole range of economics that researches the importance of variety when consuming. Now, we need to be careful because financial products tend to be complex. And therefore, if you add more variety to complex products, there might be, too much variety, right? And that's a problem that has been broadly researched in economics. And I am sure the financial industry, it's not facing that now, because right at the opposite end, there is very little variety to tackle the needs of very diverse clients. Okay, I don't want to extend this section much more. I would like to move on to the third and final section of this workshop. And in this section, we would like to discuss factors that the audience considers disruptive, factors that you believe may drive the massive adoption of financial products among consumers. Now, in this context, we're going to open the Q&A session as well again. If there's anything you want to share, any disruptive innovation that you see out there, if you think this is business as usual or not, please raise your hand and share with us your comments. Okay, I'm gonna wait for somebody to raise their hand, and in the meantime, let me mention how important it is to measure. As Diana mentioned, I believe that we are, the field is ripe for disruption, the field of financial education. In an ideal world, we have the governments and public institutions trying to measure through surveys the degree of financial education of the population. That's actually great to learn and compare the knowledge that people have regarding financial education. And then we have financial institutions, financial product providers, who through new technologies and this digital interaction that leaves a footprint, and we can track the behaviors of consumers anonymously to reach conclusions about their behavior, the level of acceptance of a product, and it helps us know what are the problems the consumer is facing to choose or not a certain product. In this analysis, in this diagnosis that the financial industry is undertaking now, I understand that this might be very disruptive for financial education purposes, because knowing and understanding the needs of consumers is absolutely key to meet them. And now, more than ever before, we have the ability to do that because of the computational capacity that we have and because of the data available that there are. So that's how I see it. There's another person waiting to take the floor and share their remarks. Please go ahead.
Hola, ¿qué tal?
Hello. Thank you very much indeed. Well, picking up on the aspects that I shared in answer to the first question. Please note that our colleague in Peru has mentioned this. Sometimes because of the policies, the financial education is just merely capabilities or accompanying, but the truth is that it is very reactive. There is some sort of a lack of, and then we just react, eh? But as you have rightly put it, the idea of using technologies in order to predict behaviors based on, hard, knowledge that can help the entire population, clients and users. I think this is the way to go. Although this is a very interesting, the anonymous factor. How do we recommend someone maintaining or without reading specifically what is their evolution, performance, and so on? So this is where we have an interesting challenge. That is, it goes beyond technology. Hey, it goes on the political side of things, or laws really, that may or may do not use these technologies in order to get closer to those recommendations. And I also wanted to say that one of the biggest barriers we may encounter is that once I share the recommendation, we get to the measurement. How do I require people to have, some tracking so I can start measuring if my recommendations, my performance changed anything or not? And this is where we make a very strong use of the EV testing. We launch a message for some population segment and another message, and we see how this is changing. We are beginning just now. There's lots to be done, but nothing else to be noted. Perhaps there's another question about infants, children. I think it is extremely relevant. And somebody from Brussels says that one of the strongest policies was inclusion of financial health from the very early years. But what happens when we can't really develop products for them? So this is the question mark. And thank you very much indeed. And I hope I could make some contribution. Oh, thank you. Yeah, anonymization is key. And this is key for segmentation purposes. Maintaining this while you get to that level of disaggregation in order to set up several types of consumers where you can make similar recommendations. And that's how the mechanism will work. Once you issue the recommendations, then the commercial manager that has some personal knowledge of the person and client or consumer in order to give some profiling to this type of advice. Secondly, we are talking about the bankerized agents, but that disruption which aims at getting to know clients better, getting closer with these type of products that can please their needs, applies to the non-banking clients, and it could be the financial industry with these records, with the non-bankerized clients, but also the telecom companies, based upon the registries and the use of mobile devices. They all have mobile phones, even if they are very basic. Some patterns of consumption, and we can learn from these dynamics of the non-banking population, products and services that can also please their needs. And in this regard, big data, at the end of the day, the financial institutions, if the client is operating in a digital fashion through their mobile devices or with a credit card, we may see the behavior step by step of the different registries, and if the product they have hired, it's being used or not. This would be another aspect to it, to measuring the impact of some financial education. So individuals are aware of these, or of the importance of saving for their retirement. So they open a pension plan, and they never did any pension scheme contribution apart from the initial one-off. So this can help them, or perhaps they receive the message. Saving for the future is important. We highly encourage you to start investing on a pension scheme, thus filtering those individuals that do have an open pension scheme that never did any contribution whatsoever. A campaign is done to raise awareness about the importance of saving for the future. If you approach someone that on a monthly basis make sure that their contribution to the pension plan, if you approach them with such a message, could be offensive, redundant, and but the measurement is key from my point of view. And with the tools at our disposal, I think we are better prepared than ever in order to carry out this impact analysis, getting to know consumers better, offering the specific products based on their needs, not only bankerized ones, but also those excluded from the financial system. I would like to add only that on top of this, apart from the technology, policies, tracking, everything that you're reinforcing, I think it was key to carry out an in-depth analysis of the performance, the behavioral economics itself. How do they behave? And also, because this is not only a matter of technology, but also language. How do we communicate with each other? What's very interesting, as I said earlier on, from the Latin America point of view, such resilience, resistance, getting closer to the financial institutions, because of the jargon we use. And with that, those type of tools, we can pave the way. Why? Because the way in which we communicate, we listen, in which they can perceive greater trust, or even shape up or trace a one-way possibility that, if properly understood and if it's familiar for the individuals, they can, embark on that road. I couldn't agree more. And you're touching upon an issue that I find very interesting. And Diana Mejia also is very familiar with it. We have developed a project that aims at interviewing consumers of the financial system. And those same interviews with the commercial heads of banks, carrying out an in-depth analysis that Amir mentioned. The analysis of savings, how comfortable are they in, engaged in their personal finance, conversations, and with the technology fully available for the analysis of the processing of the natural speech. This is a huge mine that I believe is going to be very disruptive, and we are going to learn an awful lot, many new things. Thank you very much, Omir. I think unless you have any further interventions or presentations, it is now time to close our workshop. I would like to thank all participants in this workshop, those connecting from overseas, those willing to share their thoughts, ideas, and experiences and reflections, as well as those that that have participated listening. Thank you all the speakers, because these have been, inspirational speeches, and these are examples that are extremely useful. Added value can be extracted in generating the know-how, in generating the collaborative frameworks. I will close my presentation now by just trying to recap, high-level recap, basically, of what been said here. There is a strong need, first of all, to have a full diagnosis, a starting point of our societies in all fields, offer, demand, in terms of financial capabilities, knowledge, setting up a good diagnosis of the situation and the starting point, allowing the different stakeholders to interact in different collaborative frameworks, properly regulated, where we can guarantee that the use of codes of conduct that allow the minimization of conflicts of interest, agents acting at the same time, developing tools and implementing those tools that can improve financial health. But this is not it. We must carry out an impact analysis of those tools, of those interventions, in order to go back to that starting point. Measurement, correction, and going back to interaction and cooperation among all the different stakeholders, and to avoid abandoning this virtuous circle. And with it, I hand over the floor to Lydia in case she wants to close this session. Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you all, Noelia, for excellent chairing of this workshop. And thank you very much for sharing your knowledge, your know-how that I would like to share with all participants who've taken place in this workshop, sharing their views and best practices. Thank you, Noelia. It has been a sheer pleasure to take part in this workshop. To close, please remember, all participants, that tomorrow we have a new meeting at this EduFin Summit on the 26th, by mistake, on the 26th of May, next Wednesday, at 3 p.m. We will have the closing session of the EduFin Summit, where we will discuss the purpose of financial institutions and the use of financial health financial education as a key lever to improve financial health of individuals. To close the event, we will count with Pierre Mann from the Joint Office to the General Secretariat of Inclusion and Financial Health, and José Manuel González Páramo, who is going to make a wonderful summary of this event, and he's going to share his final conclusions. And I would like to thank you for your participation. Thank you all for your contribution. Thank you, Noelia, for chairing this workshop. And without further ado, let's see each other on Wednesday. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.